The screen door didn't slam. That was the first thing she noticed. He came up the walk slower than usual, hat in his hand instead of on his head, and she knew, before he said a word. No job today. Maybe no job this week. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. She wiped her hands on her apron, looked past him at the darkening yard, and said only, "Supper's not ready yet. Sit down." That was it. No tears, no accusation, no question about what they would do now, because they both already knew what they would do. They would do what they did last time, and the time before that. He would eat, rest an hour, and go looking again tomorrow. She would look at what was left in the kitchen and decide how many days it needed to cover. This was not a scene from a novel. This was Tuesday, in thousands of American homes, during years when a paycheck could vanish overnight and nobody owed you an explanation why. And here is what modern viewers often miss when they look back at marriages like this one. Nobody was performing strength. Nobody was trying to look brave for a camera or a neighbor. This was simply how the day went. A husband failed to find work more often than he wanted to admit, and a wife absorbed that failure into a plan, without turning it into a wound between them. We like to imagine that old marriages lasted because people back then loved each other more purely, more deeply, more sincerely than couples do today. That is a comforting story. It is also, mostly, wrong. What kept a Depression-era marriage together was not a stronger feeling, it was a stronger structure. He earned, or tried to. She stretched what he earned until it covered more than it should have been able to cover. He fixed what broke. She made what didn't break last twice as long. Neither one waited to be asked. Neither one kept score, not because they were saints, because the family would not survive if they did. Think about that for a moment, because it cuts against almost everything we're told about marriage today. We are taught that a good marriage is one where you feel fulfilled, where your partner completes you, where love is measured in how happy you feel walking through the door each evening. A Depression-era couple would have found that idea almost foreign. They didn't marry expecting to feel happy every day. They married expecting hardship, and they built a life that could hold hardship without breaking. That is not a small distinction. That is the whole story. Somewhere between the 1930s and now, marriage quietly changed jobs. It used to be a working partnership, built to survive bad years. Today, for many people, it has become an emotional contract, one that can be canceled the moment it stops feeling good. We call that progress. Sometimes it is, but it also means we lost something the old home understood without ever having to say it out loud. A marriage that only exists to make you happy is a marriage that has no plan for the day you're not. Tonight, we're going back into homes where the husband came in with empty pockets more often than anyone wanted, where the wife remade a coat for the third winter in a row without complaint, and where two people who never used the word partnership out loud lived it every single day, because the alternative was going under, together, apart, or somewhere in between. This is not a story about perfect love. It's a story about what marriage had to become when giving up simply wasn't affordable, and what we may have traded away when it finally became one. To understand how a marriage held together in those years, you have to understand what marriage was actually for, not what it symbolized, what it did. In a Depression-era household, a husband and wife were not two individuals pursuing personal happiness under the same roof. They were the two working halves of a single operation. He was responsible for finding income wherever it existed. A few days on a road crew, a week unloading freight, seasonal work on someone else's farm, anything that paid in cash or in kind. She was responsible for making that income outlast itself, not spend it well, outlast it. Make a dollar behave like $1.25. This division was not romantic. It was not written down anywhere. Nobody sat the young couple down on their wedding day and explained the terms, but everybody knew the terms, because everybody had grown up watching them in action in their own parents' kitchen. And here is the part that modern viewers sometimes resist hearing. This division worked precisely because neither partner expected the other to also provide emotional completeness on top of everything else. He was not expected to be her best friend, her therapist, her romantic ideal, and her provider all at once. She was not expected to be his soulmate, his cook, his nurse, and his emotional support, all wrapped into one exhausted woman standing over a stove. They expected each other to hold up a function, and because the bar was function, not fulfillment, it was a bar they could actually clear, even on the worst weeks. That distinction matters more today than it did then, because today, we've raised the bar so high that almost no ordinary human being, under ordinary pressure, in an ordinary week, can consistently meet it. We ask marriage to deliver constant emotional satisfaction. The old home only asked marriage to deliver survival. Survival, it turns out, is a much more achievable goal. Picture the scene again, a little closer this time. It's early evening. He's just come in from a day that produced nothing. No work, no pay, nothing to show for the miles he walked between one closed door and the next. She's already seen it in his shoulders before he said a word. There's a version of this scene, a modern version, where this becomes a fight, where she asks why he didn't try harder, where he snaps back that he tried everywhere, where the tension turns into blame because someone needs somewhere to put the fear. That version happened too, in real homes, in real years. Let's be honest about that before we go any further. Depression-era marriages were not immune to resentment, exhaustion, or cruelty. Money problems strained people then exactly the way they strain people now. Some marriages cracked under the weight. Some homes were not warm. Some husbands drank away what little there was. Some wives carried burdens no person should carry alone, with no way out and no one to tell. We are not here tonight to pretend hardship made everyone noble. It didn't. It just made most people stay, for reasons that were sometimes healthy and sometimes very much not. But in the homes that held, and there were many, what kept them standing was not the absence of fear. It was what they did with the fear once it arrived. She doesn't ask what happened. She already knows what happened, because it's happened before, and it will happen again before the year is out. What she asks, silently, in her own head, is a different question entirely. What do we have, and how many days does it need to cover? That is not coldness. That is triage. That is a woman running the numbers so her husband doesn't have to watch her panic on top of his own. This is where the old marriage reveals its actual engine. It wasn't affection that kept the household upright in that moment. It was function, executed without being asked. He sits down. He eats what there is, and if it's less than usual, neither of them says so out loud. Tomorrow he goes out again, because that's the job. Not a job he was hired for, but the job of finding a job, which in those years was itself a full day's labor with no guarantee of pay at the end of it. Meanwhile, she is already deciding what tonight's dinner means for the rest of the week. If there's a little less on his plate, there will be a little less on everyone's plate, spread out so no one notices exactly where the shortage lives. This is not a story about a woman sacrificing herself silently while a man fails to provide. It's a story about two people running parallel systems that only worked because both systems were running at full capacity, all the time, without complaint becoming the loudest sound in the house. Because here's what a lot of people forget when they look back at this generation. The husband was doing his part too, and it was just as invisible as hers. He was the one who came home and, instead of collapsing into a chair, checked the back step that had been loose since spring. He was the one who noticed the kitchen chair was wobbling and pulled two mismatched screws from a coffee can in the shed, instead of saying, "We'll get a new one when things pick up." Things picking up was not a plan. A tightened screw was a plan. While she stitched a collar that had frayed for the second time that winter, mending it by lamplight because daylight was for other chores. He was in another corner of the same small house, doing the same kind of work with his hands instead of a needle. Nobody called this partnership out loud. Nobody needed to. It was partnership because two separate forms of labor were quietly keeping the same family upright at the same time, without either person waiting for applause. And this is where the story starts to complicate the simple, comforting version people like to tell about the good old days. It would be easy to say that Depression-era couples were simply better at loving each other. That's not quite it. What they were better at, because they had no other option, was showing up as a function, even on days when the feeling wasn't there. Love, as we define it now, is often treated as a feeling that must be present to justify the relationship. In that era, the relationship came first, and whatever feeling was available on a given day rode along with it, sometimes strong, sometimes worn thin, sometimes nearly invisible under exhaustion and fear. That's not a lesser kind of marriage. It might, in fact, be a sturdier one. Because a marriage built on feeling collapses the moment feeling runs out. And feeling always runs out. On someone, in some season, no matter how good the marriage is. A marriage built on function has something to stand on even during the seasons when the feeling isn't there. It gives people a reason to keep doing the work of loving each other until the feeling comes back around, instead of walking away the moment it goes quiet. There's a smaller scene worth sitting with here, one that never made it into any history book, because nobody thought it was worth writing down. It's just a small gesture, the kind that happened in thousands of kitchens without a witness. She sets the table, and without saying anything, she gives him the slightly larger portion. Not because she isn't hungry, because tomorrow he needs to walk further than she does, and she has already done this math without consciously deciding to. He notices. He doesn't say thank you, not in words, he just eats it, and later that night, without being asked, he takes her worn shoes off the hook by the door and quietly resoles them with a scrap of leather he'd been saving for exactly this. Neither of them narrates any of it. That's the point. Affection, in that house, didn't announce itself. It just did the next necessary thing. This is where the modern comparison becomes almost impossible to avoid, and where the episode stops being purely nostalgic and starts becoming, frankly, a little uncomfortable. Because how many of us, today, would recognize an act of love that doesn't come with a word attached to it? We've built an entire culture around expressing feelings out loud, telling your partner you appreciate them, naming your love language, checking in about your emotional needs. Those things aren't bad, but somewhere in all that naming, we may have lost the older skill of simply doing the thing without narrating it. The old marriage ran on quiet function. Ours often runs on constant communication about whether the function is being appreciated enough. And that brings us to the deeper current running underneath this whole story, one that we have to be honest about, because ignoring it would be dishonest to the people who actually lived it. For many women in this era, staying in a marriage wasn't purely a matter of loyalty or love, it was often a matter of survival. There was enormous social and religious pressure against divorce. Pressure from church, from family, from neighbors who would talk for years about a woman who left. And beyond the social pressure, there was something colder and more practical. A woman with no independent income, in a country still decades away from real financial protections for women, often had almost nowhere to go if a marriage ended. Divorce didn't just mean social shame. It frequently meant poverty on top of poverty, with children in tow and no safety net beneath any of it. We have to say this plainly because it matters. Not every marriage that lasted back then lasted because it was healthy. Some lasted because leaving was simply not survivable. That is not a footnote to this story. That is part of the story. The strength we're describing tonight, the quiet division of labor, the wordless gestures, the shared discipline, was real, and it held countless families together through genuine hardship. But it existed inside a system that also trapped people who might have been better off apart, and we do those people no honor by pretending every marriage that endured was a happy one. What we can say, honestly, is this: for the marriages that did work, where both people were, in their own limited and imperfect way, trying, the structure of shared function gave them something to hold on to when feeling alone would not have been enough. It gave them a reason to keep showing up for each other on the days the marriage didn't feel like love at all. It just felt like work. And they did the work anyway, because the alternative wasn't a better life. It was often no life at all, for either of them, and certainly not for the children watching from the next room. That's the foundation we're building from as we go deeper tonight. Not a fairy tale about a golden age of marriage, a clear-eyed look at what marriage actually had to become, for better and for worse, when the world outside offered no comfort and no guarantee, and what that reveals about the marriage we've built in its place. There's a night worth describing in full, because it says more about this kind of marriage than a dozen gentle scenes ever could. It's late. The children are asleep, or pretending to be. The kitchen table has two things on it: a small stack of bills and a coffee can with less in it than either of them wants to admit out loud. He's been staring at the same spot on the table for a long moment. She's the one who finally speaks. We're short again. Not a question. A statement, flat and tired. And here is where the myth of the peaceful, uncomplaining Depression-era household falls apart, because what usually followed a moment like this wasn't calm. It was an argument, quiet, because the walls were thin and the children were close, but real. He says he's tried every job in 3 towns. She says she knows that. She's not blaming him, but knowing doesn't fill the can. He says something sharper than he means to. She says something back that lands harder than she intended. The fear in the room isn't really about the money anymore. It's about whether either of them is enough to fix what's broken, and neither one can say that part out loud, so it comes out sideways, as irritation about nothing in particular. This is not the postcard version of the past. This is 2 exhausted people, frightened in a way that has nowhere else to go, taking a small piece of that fear out on the person closest to them, because that person is the only one in the room. It happened then, it happens now. Nothing about hardship makes people immune to snapping at the ones they love most. What's different is what happens after. There's no slam door, because there's nowhere to go, no separate bedroom down a long hallway, no car to drive off in for an hour to cool down, sometimes not even a second room in the house at all. They are, physically, stuck with each other in that moment, and stuck with the argument until it burns itself out. And more often than not, it did burn itself out. Not because either of them apologized with a neat little speech, but because morning came, and there was work to do, and the work didn't care who was right the night before. He gets up before dawn anyway. She's already up too, because the stove doesn't light itself. Neither of them says, "I'm sorry," in so many words. He fixes the coffee can lid that's been bent for weeks. She puts a little more on his plate than she takes for herself. The argument doesn't get resolved. It gets absorbed, back into the daily function of 2 people who don't have the luxury of staying angry, because staying angry doesn't put bread on the table, and neither one of them can afford to carry a grudge and a full day's work at the same time. We shouldn't romanticize this either. There's something almost brutal about a life that gives you no room to properly process a fight, no time to sit with hurt feelings, no space to talk it all the way through the way a counselor today might recommend. That's a real loss, and it's worth naming. But there's also something we've lost in the other direction, the old, blunt understanding that a disagreement doesn't have to end a marriage, that 2 people can be furious with each other on a Tuesday night and standing shoulder to shoulder over the same stove by Wednesday morning, simply because the family needed them both, and needed them both there. Now, put that same argument into a modern kitchen. The bills are different. A car payment instead of rent, a credit card statement instead of a coffee can, but the fear underneath is often eerily similar. Not enough money, not enough certainty, too much pressure landing on 2 people at once. The argument starts the same way arguments always start, but watch what's available to a modern couple that wasn't available in 1934. There's a guest room to retreat to. There's a phone to text a friend who will validate every feeling and question the relationship itself before the fight is even over. There's a therapist's website bookmarked for when things get bad enough. There's a quiet, growing cultural permission to ask a very different question than the one that Depression-era couple was asking. Not, how do we get through this together, but, is this relationship actually meeting my needs? That question isn't wrong to ask. Sometimes it's exactly the right question, and sometimes the honest answer is that the relationship truly isn't safe or healthy, and leaving is the right and necessary choice. We are not here to tell anyone to stay somewhere harmful for the sake of nostalgia, but it's worth noticing how easily that question can also become an exit ramp from ordinary hardship. The kind of hardship every long marriage runs into, the kind that isn't a sign the marriage is broken, just a sign that two human beings are tired, scared, and stretched thin for a season. The old marriage didn't have an exit ramp built into the architecture of the house. That absence forced a lot of people to endure things they shouldn't have had to endure, and we've already said that plainly, and we mean it. But that same absence also forced a lot of ordinary bad nights to simply be survived, instead of treated as evidence, and in doing so, it gave a lot of marriages a chance to come out the other side of a hard season instead of ending inside one. This is where the episode's real question comes into focus. Somewhere between that Depression-era kitchen and the modern one, marriage quietly stopped being primarily a working partnership and became, for many people, primarily an emotional experience, one measured moment to moment by how fulfilled, how happy, how met a person feels. That shift brought real gains. Women are no longer trapped by economic dependence the way that wife at the kitchen table was. People are no longer expected to endure genuine cruelty simply because divorce carries shame. Those changes are not small, and no one should wish them away. But the shift brought a quieter cost too, one that rarely gets named directly. When marriage becomes primarily about how it makes you feel, every ordinary bad week becomes a referendum on the relationship itself. A rough month at work, a stretch of exhaustion with small children, a season where money is tight and tempers are short. These things used to be understood as simply weather, something a marriage weathered, together, because that was the whole point of having a partner in the first place. Today, that same rough season can just as easily become evidence that the relationship isn't working. Evidence gathered and weighed against a standard of constant fulfillment that almost no long relationship, in any era, could realistically sustain. Think about what the old couple actually had. Stripped of all the hardship and all the fear, they had a working definition of success that didn't depend on feeling wonderful all the time. Success was simple. The children were fed. The rent, however late, eventually got paid. Nobody left. That was enough to call the marriage a good one, even in a week that felt like nothing but struggle. By that standard, a marriage could be strained, tired, and imperfect, and still be considered working, because working was the actual goal. By our modern standard, a marriage can be stable, safe, and even happy most of the time, and still feel like it's failing, because it isn't providing constant emotional peak experiences. We've raised the bar so high that ordinary human marriage, the kind that has always included dull stretches, tired stretches, irritable stretches, can start to look like evidence of a mismatch, rather than simply evidence of being married to another flawed, tired human being for a long time. There's a phrase worth sitting with here, one that captures something the old home understood without ever putting it into a self-help book. A marriage that only exists to make you happy has no plan for the day you're not. The Depression-era marriage had a plan for that day. The plan wasn't romantic. The plan was, you still show up, you still put the coffee on, you still sew the collar and fix the step, and give the bigger portion to the person who needs the strength more that day. Feeling comes and goes, function stays. None of this means we should return to a world where women had no financial independence, where cruelty was endured for lack of alternatives, where staying was sometimes simply the only option left. That world had real and serious costs, and we should not want it back. But somewhere inside that flawed, difficult structure, there was a piece of wisdom worth rescuing. The idea that a good partner is not only someone who makes you feel good, but someone who keeps showing up for the function of the family, especially on the days feeling good isn't available to anyone in the house. That's the piece we've largely set down, and it's worth asking, honestly, whether we set it down because we outgrew it, or because we simply stopped valuing what it actually did for people, for their children, for their sense of stability, for the quiet, undramatic proof that no matter how bad a week got, nobody was walking out that door. The marriages that survived the hardest years of the 20th century were not survived by luck, and they were not survived because love back then was somehow purer or stronger than love today. They were survived by two people who understood their marriage as a job neither of them was allowed to quit, not because quitting was illegal, but because quitting meant everyone went under, together. And in showing up for that job, day after unglamorous day, they built something that outlasted the hardship that created it, a kind of trust that didn't need to be spoken, because it had already been proven, one wobbly chair, one mended collar, and one shared plate at a time. So, what do we actually take from a night like that one? The coffee can on the table, the argument nobody apologized for out loud, the morning that came anyway and asked for coffee to be made and work to be found. Not that hardship makes love stronger. It doesn't. Hardship just reveals what a marriage was actually built on. And for the couples who made it through those years, what it was built on was not a feeling that never wavered. It was a function that never stopped. Even on the nights the feeling was nowhere to be found. He didn't stay because every day felt good. She didn't stay because he always said the right thing. They stayed because the family needed both of them standing in the same kitchen, doing two different jobs that only worked as one job, and because somewhere along the way, without ever naming it, they had decided that showing up for each other was not conditional on how the week had gone. We should be honest, one more time, that this world was not fair to everyone in it. Some people stayed because leaving was truly not survivable, and that is a real cost this episode does not pretend away. But for the marriages that worked, the ones with real trust underneath the exhaustion, there was a kind of strength in them that we may have quietly traded away for comfort. We gained freedom, safety, and choice. We may have lost the plain, unglamorous understanding that love is often just showing up, again, on a day you didn't feel like it, because someone was counting on you to. If this episode brought back a memory, a grandmother who never said "I love you" out loud, but always gave you the bigger piece, a grandfather who fixed everything in silence and never once mentioned it, that's worth holding on to. That wasn't old-fashioned stubbornness. That was a marriage built to survive, doing exactly what it was built to do. If this meant something to you, subscribe to the Depression-era home, give this video a like, and tell us in the comments what your parents or grandparents did to keep their marriage and their family standing through the hardest years. Did your grandmother mend the same coat 3 winters in a row? Did your grandfather fix things without ever being asked? Share this with someone who remembers a marriage like this one. Your memory might be exactly what helps someone else understand their own family a little better. They didn't marry expecting comfort. They married expecting it would be hard, and they stayed anyway. Maybe that's not a lesser kind of love. Maybe it's the kind we've forgotten how to give.